So, welcome to the Rick Bisson Podcast. This is episode number 19, and I am so excited to have as our guest today, Doran Wright. And I have to say that about a year ago, if I looked at the radar of my life, there was a blip that showed up about a year ago, and I heard this name, Doran Wright. And then the blip just kept getting bigger and bigger, and it appeared again, and it reached the circle finally when I met you at our soiree last year for fireworks, and yet it still wasn't in the center. And now I'm fortunate to get together with you and a group of great men on Friday mornings for a session where we get to talk and share thoughts. And it's just been a thrill to get to know you, Doran, and the work that you do.
Likewise.
Well, thank you. The work that you do out there in the world, which isn't just this, world that we live in our little geographic sphere here. It's much greater than that. And I'm super excited to learn more about, where that comes from for you and what you're doing for people to hear, because I think it's such a needed. You're just tapping into places that most people don't go. I think they avoid it, and your presence there is so important. So I just wanted to read something that I wrote, or that you wrote, excuse me.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. It was a post that you made a while ago, maybe in other places too. It says, "The heart gets broken in out-of-the-way places where little light gets in and people on the outside don't see. I liken my work at times to a miner who descends deep shafts. Except the shafts I descend dig through layers of trauma, not earth. It can be dangerous work, but well worth the descent. And the discoveries at the bottom can be beautiful. But at the same time, that is also where the heart can get broken, because not everything discovered can be recovered." So you're in places that most of us are not. And tell us more about, start where you'd like, or I'll ask questions.
Well, I think those places of descent actually begin in my own childhood. And it's a pretty narrow gap I've come to discover between my own childhood experiences and many of the young people that I work with. In my latter stage career, if you will, working with justice-involved youth primarily, but not always justice-involved youth, but I would say youth on the margins, youth that have often experienced the effects of living in what I like to call multiple overlapping systems of oppression, whether it's education, housing, healthcare. I've just been able to connect some of my own story to the stories of kids I encounter with, and that's where life happens. And to be clear, I grew up with a fair amount of privilege, although some would say, well, you were on the other side of the tracks, on the good side of the tracks, to use that metaphor. But I've just come over time to really relate to and have a heart for the misfits, what the world would consider like the cast-offs and the ones, well, let's move on to the ones who have the real potential, because there's the ones who are excelling in the classroom. Those are the ones who don't present with the behavioral issues. And those are the ones that we can see, well, he's going to be a doctor and a lawyer and an educator and all of that. So
So where did the work, where was your first project, or how did you kind of launch into this from a career perspective? And I use the word career. I know that it's not a career, it's a
calling. It really is. It's a calling. Well, it began in high school, actually. It began in my own high school experience, which is, a few years ago.
Just a couple.
Just a few. And it started in the basement of a church that my dad served in Connecticut, Stamford, Connecticut, where my dad was the choir director. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Jesus Revolution or not.
I haven't yet.
Haven't yet. Well, there's a figure in that movie, prominent figure in that movie, who my youth group leader strongly identified with, actually in real life, but resembled, actually. And I wouldn't say he was sort of a Pied Piper, but he was very charismatic, and he had a real heart for young people, and not just, as I say, not just for the achievers, but whom the world might look at as kind of losers. And, I never saw myself one way or the other, but just as a kid who needed a home. And this is a church that didn't have a big youth group, and there was an opening for me to serve in that capacity. So right from the jump in high school, I got involved in that and just began to gather youth around, and we we were a collection of misfits. And not that my wife is a misfit, but that's where I met my wife now, decades. And so that's where I really began, I think, to have a heart and an affinity and some skills for the work. Although I took a grand departure because I thought, well, I don't want to be in this posture all my life. I'd like to make money and go for the bright and shiny things. And it's a big part of my story that's all about running after the bright and shiny and fast and cool things in life. So, but that was my first point of connection was in my high school years.
And so in high school, you're in a youth group. Are you organically getting kids to join in this youth group, or is this an assignment that you have to go out and...
Well, it's hard to say. I think there was some attractional component to this, and I don't think we really worked very hard to gather kids. I think they just sort of came, and it might have been the proximity of where this church was in this downtown Stamford, Connecticut location, and it was kind of easy to get them, and we had connections in the high schools, and they would come, and it never got really big, but it was a lot of fun. And I had a little, back at the time, a little Opel GT. And I remember, 1972 Opel GT and cramming kids way beyond the legal limit. It was stuff them in, and we'd go places, and we'd do things. And it was a blast. It was a real blast.
Maybe seatbelts weren't required back then.
I don't think so. Yeah. And nor were helmets. So, but anyway, it was, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So a heart for kids and ministry, I would say. Yeah.
But I think there was also, and it's part of the story, and I'll just go there briefly, that there was some, because I grew up in a, on the fringes of Fairfield County, Connecticut is the Gold Coast. And it's where, you measured your worth by your wealth. And so I also made friends with those of significant means. And, I had friends in school who became CEOs of multinational corporations and top lawyers, and I could name them. The high school I attended in Norwalk, which wasn't the most affluent town, and nevertheless, I cut a record in high school with, not I personally, but my high school choir with Dave Brubeck. I worked in a boatyard where Leonard Bernstein got his speedboat on retirement from the New York Philharmonic, and I was assigned to help orient him to the boat and to the Norwalk Islands. So I rubbed shoulders with some pretty wealthy and influential people, and frankly, it was a little bit of a needle to the veins. And I said, you know what? I like that glitter. I like that gold. I like that lifestyle. I'm going to pursue that a little bit. And so a lot of my life was just like running away from something, but not really running towards something. There was a point of decision, I believe, that God brought in my life where he said, you could choose this way or that way, and this way is a way of blessing, and this way is a way of hardship. But I chose the way of hardship. But, he redeems it all anyway. But there was that time where I really felt like there was this call to, we would at some point call it like full-time ministry. I don't really like the term, but I didn't pursue that. And I did a lot of things along the way, which, as I say, I think it all, contributes to what I'm able to do today, which requires a pretty big toolkit and a pretty wide perspective on life.
Because I've noticed that about you, that you're in the trenches with those in the deepest need, and you're also at the level with, I'll call it leadership, the people that are helping to orchestrate these organizations to help them be better prepared to deal with these.
It's no, it's really not a boast. It's just a gift from God that I can go from the boardroom to the trenches, in an hour. But the real gift of that is, if you're going to do systems change work, which if we want to be really technical about it, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing systems change work. I'm about destroying and dismantling systems of oppression. But you can't do that unless you have a real connection to those who are actually suffering under the oppression, who are actually affected by the systems we seek to change. And neither can you just change systems without understanding that there's no permanence to that unless the people leading the change, unless the real voice for change are not people like myself, but those who we're getting out of the way so those affected by the change. For example, young people in lockup, we know that their destiny is leadership. So we have to get out of the way and put our organization that I'm on staff with, Straight Ahead Ministries, for 36 years has been all about seeing young people who've been, captive to these systems become empowered. Not that we give them power, but as we help them to find their agency and their faith and that spiritual strength to move into these positions of leadership, and they then begin to change these systems, and that's the way these new systems that emerge begin to have legs and become sustainable. So it's a both and. So that's my story. Sort of like God has given me tools to work on both ends.
That's great. You mentioned that the youth that are incarcerated are destined for leadership. Is that what you said?
That's exactly what I said. Yeah.
So it's one direction.
They're
or the
born
other.
Leaders.
Leaders.
It's not to a person, but I mean, generally speaking, we have a program that we run called Leadership Unlocked, and a lot of it is just being able to identify those strengths and helping them to see the strengths that are inherent to them, and then put tools at their disposal so that they can then live into those God-given strengths and gifts and talents and abilities. A person who can engineer a drug deal on the corner has all the capabilities of engineering in a very sophisticated real estate deal at a high corporate level, or other things. I mean, there's a lot of kids who are really very transactionally minded, but at the same time, have high EQ, have a lot of emotional intelligence, but it's often just been suppressed by the traumas in which they've grown up in.
So, would you be willing to describe some of these programs, or can you describe some of the programs that you're active in now and have been?
Well, I'm active. I'll just say that Straight Ahead Ministries, which has been around for 36 years, has served justice-involved youth in two ways. One, in institutional settings, where we go into locked, or we call secure facilities, and then those that are less secure, we call them staff secure facilities. And we do faith-based, strengths-based programming. We don't call them Bible studies, we call them Bible discussion groups. But we really get kids to try to lead those themselves, and we say, well, you know what? We're not going to answer questions you're not asking. We try to look at what are the issues that they're dealing with day to day, and then we try to frame a biblical perspective around those. We keep them practical. We have volunteers who go into facilities in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. We were dormant in Maine for a few years, and this is all part of my coming back here a year ago, is because I just felt like, there was fresh opportunity here. I won't go into it ad nauseum here, but there's lots of policy changes happening in the way that we view youth who are involved with the criminal justice system, to decriminalize them and to put more services in front of them even before they have any contact with law enforcement. But if they have contact with law enforcement, then how are their stay, as we call it, in a facility lessened over time, but also how services are placed in front of them to either divert them from the system or get them out more quickly and connected to services so they don't reoffend or recidivate, some of those technical terms, and go back in. So we do work inside facilities that are strengths-based, faith-based programming, often led by volunteers who can be, with the lived experience of the youth, and then not. There's no real high bar of criteria. There's certain state criteria people have to meet, and we are dealing with minors by and large, those under 18. So we have to respect a lot of confidentiality and legal issues. But we also work with a lot of young people who are exiting the system, and often exiting the system without a lot of support. In fact, going back into environments where it's very tough to succeed because you're often not set up for success to begin with, or when you go back. You go back into a school system that really doesn't want to have you back, into a community where you're labeled as the offender, and can be very unwelcoming. You're often going back into very unstable housing and family situations. So just as for instance, Straight Ahead, which is a faith-based organization, over 35 years, has nevertheless won great favor with government. And we have recently been awarded a very significant grant, approaching $1 million, to operate 5 re-entry sites across the state of Massachusetts in 5 locations. We have staff in each of these locations, and we call them re-entry sites. And often our staff do have that lived experience. We've hired 2 new people, just wonderful people in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's our newest re-entry site. And we have a program within that called Ready for Life. Ready for Life is a 3-day intensive program that takes young people who are exiting the system and really deals with mental toughness, spiritual development, socialization, a variety of things, and really equips them with life skills so that when they launch back out, they're doing so on a stable platform. It's not a jobs program, it's not a housing program, but we also help kids connect with resources. We also have a partnership in Gloucester, Massachusetts, with an organization called Cornerstone Creative, which is a faith-based woodworking mentoring life skills program, which builds furniture on contract with municipalities, like picnic tables and park benches and things like that, and in the North Shore of Massachusetts, and does other things. And so some of our folks get into that program as well. That's what we're looking to replicate in Maine, God willing, over the time to come, because we know we have a lot of things here in Maine, wood being one of them, right?
Right.
So
yes.
and a lot of folks who have a desire to work with their hands. So that's sort of what's on the horizon here, institutional side, and continuing to work. We have one facility in Maine. It's called Long Creek Youth Development, built to house upward of 200 young people. It houses an eighth of that now, about 20. Am I doing my fractions correctly? Under 25 are housed at Long Creek right now. That number, that small number, is attributable to the fact that more effort is being made to divert young people from a situation where they have to get in a confined situation. A confined situation, and now I'm putting on my advocacy hat, is not a place where you find health and healing. It is a place where you often are re-traumatized, and in these confined settings, it's not a place that promotes healing. It's always an area for policy debate because, public safety first, right? And often the kids can be a danger to themselves or a danger to the community unless certain needs are met and they're holistically met. So, but there's a lot of fruit to be had in those settings, and that's where I work on a weekly basis. In Long Creek, engaging with some of the most incredible young men. A few girls are in that situation, but I don't interact with the girls. But I wish I would have brought with me something that, speaking of girls, I'll tell you a little. I'll tell you a little story. So, one of our partner organizations is a magazine called Freestyle, and unfortunately, Freestyle had to go out of business. It published a magazine on a quarterly basis for a number of years that was, from an editorial and graphics and all content standpoint, positioned to young people who were in lockup. And it's my privilege to distribute these magazines, and any facility, Connecticut, Maine, that I would go into was able to hand these magazines out. And I can't tell you exactly when. I was in Hartford Juvenile Detention in Connecticut, and I passed out an edition, and there were several girls in there, and handed them out. There was a time when I would have lunch every single week with every single kid who was in this detention facility. And it was just such a joy to do that, because you could interact with them, you could hear their stories, you could engage with them, ask, "Can I pray for you?" whatever. So there was this one girl I connected with, gave her a magazine, and then I moved to Maine, and I don't get back to Connecticut as often as I do. I have other people who are going in. And so I went back about 10 days ago, and I had the latest and unfortunately the last edition of Freestyle magazine, and I handed it out. And I'm at one end of the cafeteria speaking with a young lady who's new in the facility, hearing her story and so forth. And all of a sudden, from the other end of the cafeteria, I hear this shriek, and this girl goes, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it. I'm in the magazine. They took my story. They published my artwork."
Outstanding.
And there she's holding up this magazine, and there's an illustration of a heart. And there is her story called A Strong Heart. And it's her story about how, before she's even age 16, how she's been shot twice, literally shot. And we know that percentages are very high. Well over 60% of young people in a juvenile facility have either witnessed a gunshot or been shot themselves. Incredible statistics. And there's her story in print for the whole world to see, and how every other paragraph, God never gave up on me, my mother never gave up on me, and I'm able to lean into the future with hope because I have this new foundation. So that's the work we get to do on the inside. The outside, a little more challenging. And there's another layer to the outside work now, too, which is we have a lot of kids. They're not being locked up, but they're not receiving services. So where are they? They're in the cracks and the crevices. They're in the trenches, right? They're still tearing up the town, as it were, but they need to be engaged. So the other day, I was, up in Rockland meeting with some folks. Rockland's been in the news lately about a place that has had some issues with young people who've been sort of like disconnected from school. They're not receiving services, and so we're trying to get our heads around that. They are, quote unquote, justice involved because they've had contact with law enforcement, but yet they're at this place of falling through a crack. So that's another area where we're looking at how do we effectively connect with those kids and prevent a worse outcome.
You mentioned that there's incarceration, and then there's services out that do exist to
reintegrate
when they reintegrate after being in correction,
right?
A correction facility, and often those services that are provided are job related, maybe housing related, maybe not lifestyle related, and a foundation that they can really live on, because these other things are sort of, I'm not sure how to describe them. They're economic and their health, but you're really going to the mental piece and the building of their person so that they can thrive.
And we're not, we are not clinicians, we're not therapists, but there is a great need for that clinical and that therapeutic piece. And this is where, at least in the state of Maine, we're really capacity constrained. And I say we, not as an organization and ministry, but as a state. We just do not have enough qualified, capable people who are at the ready to engage young people where they are. And And frankly, we don't have nowhere near enough housing for young people who are navigating youth homelessness, and sometimes that's a result of having some family breakup or just aging out of the foster care system. That's another issue. And some are just alienated from family because of how they identify, their gender orientation and so forth. So it's a really, really complex issue. It's really all hands on deck to try to put services in front of and around young people, whether they're actively involved in the justice system or whether they're leaving it, exiting it into some form of homelessness or into some form of unresolved mental health need. So that's a burden that we really, it's an ongoing need that we're all trying to figure out together. Yeah.
The money that you said this grant's coming from, is that private? Is that a private grant, or is it?
So the one specifically in Massachusetts is through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention under the Department of Justice, in combination with the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. It's just a testament to the fact that, as a faith-based organization, we can be trusted with government money to do right, and yet not be suspect of proselytizing and that sort of thing. So we're skilled at it. And again, I have no contact with that grant. I'd love to find that same kind of grant for the work we do in Maine, but then God willing, it'll come. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So these youth, the word mentor comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
How are they finding them? I mean, you've touched about it a little bit, but how are they finding themselves in these positions?
How are the young people finding themselves in these positions? For some, it's a matter of street life is a survival game. For some, in urban settings where there's just been a deprivation of resources, where there have been just not enough money in the household, and turning to drugs not as a lifestyle of drug dealing, but as a matter of just finding resources that aren't available otherwise.
Do you mean some drug use and dealing to provide money?
Yeah, so mom can buy groceries. I mean, there's that. I mean, I've worked with kids in every circumstance imaginable, from pandemic boredom and just schools closed down, there's nothing to do, and then we could have a whole conversation on the adolescent brain, the developing brain, and brain development, generally speaking, up to ages 25. So we know we're working with an impulsive sort of age group. Often, you're a follower before you become a leader, so you're following the wrong gang. You're just making judgments to fit in, not necessarily because something you really want to do, but sometimes you are just initiated into a gang setting or another group. We have less gangs now than more informal groups, and leadership is not exactly as organized as it was back in the days of the Blood and the Crips, if you know those terms. But there's still that to some extent. But it's really there's a lot of pack mentality for young people, and kids get swept up, not because it's something they really want to do, but because they felt at some point they really had no choice but to go along with this decision. And I find myself working with a lot of kids who, after a couple of years, say, "I don't understand why I ever did that." I mean, I had lunch with a kid a little over a week ago who he's a totally different kid than when I was working with him a few years ago during the pandemic. And, he couldn't tell me why he was doing what he was doing when he was doing it. Now he looks back, he can't still exactly explain it, but says, "I'm not doing that anymore because guess what? I've grown up." And so often what we have to recognize is that kids without a lot of privilege are forced to grow up in ways that other kids with intact households and a lot of resources at hand just never know what it is to have to adult, so quickly with such dire consequences. And then, of course, there's also Some find themselves in situations, frankly, because of over-policing, because their neighborhoods are over-policed, because they happen to have, brown skin in a certain area, and it's just, there's that aspect too. So I've worked on committees, to deal with, racial and ethnic disparities in law enforcement, and I've worked at tables trying to bring, police to better understanding of our inner city communities, because I worked for 13 years in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the largest city in the state, with a very spotty record of police community interactions, and so there's a lot of reasons they end up there, but it's not a blame-free situation, but there's a lot of causality to it that we want the wider world to understand. This is why they're there, and sometimes, as in the case of one young man I've worked with for a lot of years, it's their crimes of survival. I gotta survive. My dad was deported to wherever, and my mom put me out, and she's got this, and it's just like you hear the story, and there's credibility to it, but somewhere along the line, his basic needs or her basic needs were not being met, and that's fundamentally the case by and large.
So he's made choices because of that have put him in
harm's way. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And how do you help someone like that?
Well, the only thing that comes to mind, it really sounds kind of foolish, is first of all, you have to show them love. Yeah. Because that's the greatest unmet need. Unconditional love. And then you build from there.
Amen. Yeah. Now,
love and trust.
Love and trust.
You have to earn trust.
Well, without the love, you can't earn the trust.
Right.
I think that's how it goes in order.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So you're continuing to do this work in Maine, in Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and other places?
Well, I'm rooted in Maine now. I have a small volunteer team. Since I stepped out on a full-time basis in Connecticut, I'm now, essentially full-time in Maine with Straight Ahead Ministries. I still oversee the work in Connecticut, but I have no contact with Massachusetts, other that's where our headquarters and our monthly staff meetings are.
Yeah.
And I love our team. We have a staff of about 20 who are really experienced and just wonderful practitioners in this field. And I don't say practitioners in a technical way. I mean, with a really great breadth of skill and depth of love for the kids we work with.
And you've come in contact with some pretty amazing people throughout this process.
I do, and it's interesting. I have to give a nod to our founders, Scott and Hannah Larson, who are originally from the Midwest, from Minnesota, and they started this work 36 years ago. And Hannah had a burden for this work. She's from Denmark, and not surprisingly, ended up in Minnesota, and that's where Scott and Hannah met. And I guess they've been in Worcester, Massachusetts, for the better part of 30 years. Scott was a stockbroker. He joined. He's got a doctorate in organizational leadership, I believe it is. And they've really together just grown this ministry, and it's expanded widely. We've recently, within the last year, hired back a gentleman named Eugene Scheenberg, who just wrote a great book, and I do hand this out in facilities, called I Never Met My Father. And it's his story of literally having not met his father. But Eugene worked for the Obama administration. He was the head of the Fatherhood Initiative in the Obama administration. And he actually started with us 1994, I think, almost 20 years ago. He worked for Straight Ahead in Massachusetts and had been employed in the Massachusetts Youth Services in a correctional, or not correctional, but we don't really call youth facilities correctional. That's more like an adult term. But he did work in a juvenile setting, 20 years ago or so. So we have some great people on our team. And and other interesting people. When we intersect, we collaborate widely. Collaboration we do here, and it's very informal. It's very organic. I've done work in schools, restorative practices, and I somehow ended up involved with Midcoast Youth Center, which I'm very proud and pleased to be. In fact, I see there's a call coming in from its executive director. Even
She happens to be calling right now.
She happens to be calling right now.
Yes.
But I mean, that is just another like a gift from God that dropped in the lap, and I get to interact with a lot of kids there, and they're just the sweetest, most, and just I could go on and on.
Tell us about MYC, Maine.
So Midcoast Youth Center. Wow, I'm the least qualified to say anything about it. But it's 7 years. I think it's going into its 7th year. It's a grassroots organization founded in response to the unacceptable level of teen suicides in Saginaw County, where I think we sit right now.
We do, yes.
That's mostly identified with the city of Bath, the city of ships, and for reasons that are really hard to ferret out, over a period of years, the rate of teen suicide was just accelerating. And that was breaking the heart of this one individual whose name was Jamie Dorr, who's become a great friend.
To many, to all.
Huh?
To all.
To
Yes.
all.
Yeah.
To all. And she just took this burden and said, this has just got to stop. And little by little, with the encouragement of so many other members of the community, there was widespread agreement. This has to stop. And a coalition was formed, and the coalition then grew to become something called Midcoast Community Alliance. And then somewhere around the pandemic, it became clear that it needed to be more than just a movement. It needed to have a location. And then the city of Bath had been operating something called the Bath Indoor Skate Park, and that had sort of become a locus of let's just say behaviors that were challenging to the community. And Jamie and her small team took it over from the city of Bath, and Midcoast Youth Center then was birthed inside what is known as the Bath Armory, this moribund facility that just so happens to sit in between Morse High School and Bath Middle School. You couldn't ask for a better place to have a youth-serving facility. So under the auspices of Midcoast Youth Center, about 80 young people are served on a daily basis with after-school programming. And it's the largest indoor skate park in Maine, so it's a little bit of a revenue generator, but also it's where kids can learn to have safe, fun after school and on weekends, and have birthday parties on the weekends, and adults get to come and see it and skate. It's not only for youth on weekends; adults can use it as well. But within that Midcoast Community Alliance and Midcoast Youth Center, a couple of other things have been birthed, and that is something called the Merrymeeting Collaborative, which serves upwards of 60 to 70 youth experiencing homelessness. We have a staff person, Donna Verhoeven, who works under MYC, but under state grants, both in what we call RSU 1, that's the school district for Bath, and MSAD 75, which is the school district for Topsom. And she is just the Swiss Army knife of getting services to and around young people experiencing homelessness. That means from literal homeless to couch surfing and just in between places and doctor's appointments and all those things that go with trying to stabilize a young person who doesn't have a place to call home. So that happens under MYC. Also, MYC has won one of 6 Working Communities Challenge grants under the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And the focus of this grant, which is the tune of $375,000, has been to address what we call youth hopelessness, which is this phenomenon where, and if you read the latest statistics from our Youth Integrated Mental Health Survey, so many young people just don't experience a sense of safety at home or school, and just feel this massive disconnection from the world around them. leading to this hopelessness. And of course, that's a precursor to wanting to end one's own life. So through a variety of means, which I won't elaborate right now, but it really means like putting opportunities for hope in front of young people so they can recognize they're not alone in this world. There are people willing to walk alongside them, who get them, who can relate to them. So we do that. We do that through mentors. We do that through career development. We do a number of things. Parallel to that, we've also gotten a grant from, I say we, they, got a grant from the State Department of Education for a workforce career exploration grant. So we have someone who's working to actually get kids connected to employment as part of their graduation requirements in high school so they can actually earn credits while employed and explore meaningful careers in Maine. We know that our kids want to work. They want jobs. Everywhere I've lived, I mean, at 14, you want to work. You want to do so. I started working in a boatyard when I was 13 years old, so I get it. I would not have been in a good place if somebody didn't say, here's a sponge, go clean that boat. The world's a more formal place now, but kids want to work. They want to have meaningful on-ramps to employment. So we're doing that. So all of that's happening under Midcoast Youth Center.
Mm. And that grant from the Federal Reserve, and that's pretty significant that came to this little relatively new organization.
It is. And to be honest with you, that the Federal Reserve is also interested in systems change. Because this isn't a case, well, here's $775,000, go and spend it any way you like. No, they want to see that at the end of the day, things are changing on the ground. And so we have something called the Youth Advisory Board, the YAB. We're expanding the board of Midcoast Youth Center to include more youth representatives who are our spokespeople informing the work. And again, as I said, as I alluded to before, the only way anything is going to change for the long term is if we get the people affected by, there's a saying, nothing about us without us. And I swear by that. I also swear by, look, if you're a 14-year-old sitting across from me, and I'm my age, I'm not going to identify my age. I always tell because I'm the oldest.
Couple years older than 14.
I'm the oldest 13-year-old. Yeah, I speak in multiples of 14. So I just turned 14 this year. It's all how you do the math. But I say to them, I remind them, look, I live in your world now. You don't live in mine. Mine is going away. I have a responsibility to you now. And just by reframing things that way, they look at me differently. Oh, you mean you're really for me? You're not against me? Yeah. So,
and I think the activities that happen there all create this environment where there can be inquiry and curiosity.
Oh yeah, we engender. I mean, we engender. Look in a correctional facility where it's all about sort of. I say correctional in a facility that's in confinement. It's all about abiding by rules in order to get some reward. So, we know there's two great, and my theological mentor, Dr. Tim Keller, says, look, there's only really two reasons you do anything. It's either fear or guilt, unless you're motivated by love, unless there's some stronger, compelling motivation. So you're either complying with rules that are set before you in the expectation of either punishment or a reward. But if you really feel safe, if I'm engendering safety in that confined setting where there's vulnerability and transparency and real heart-level communication, you're going to grow in leaps and bounds. You might not exit the system until your sentence is done or you've fulfilled your requirements, but there's internal growth that's going on because you're not constrained by just rules. You're empowered by something. And the same with Midcoast Youth Center. These kids come in there, they feel safety. They feel they're not going to take the risks they would otherwise take because they know that it's not a reward, not a punishment they face, but it's more like, I don't need that. I don't need the unhealthy risk because I'm feeling such safety in here that the need for that risk sort of attenuates, if I'm using the right word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And diversity of the group there in terms of, I use the word socioeconomic. So talk about that because that fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. How can I say this without being without saying anything wrong? We have in the eyes of some not the cool kids, But
you do have some cool kids.
oh,
there.
we do. We have the cool and the uncool. I
Yeah.
mean, we've got it all. We have got it all. But what I'm saying is, and here's the magic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody gets along because everybody feels welcome, right? And God willing, as this expands and maybe turns into a campus down the way, and there's more kids. Look, there's a term called social capital. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm not.
But everybody needs it. Everybody needs social capital. And the only way you would really build it is by people from every background, every situation, being able to not look past differences, but look at differences and celebrate them. So it really is a place, without using the term inappropriately, for reconciliation. It's just, nobody says, oh, I'm reconciling with you. But this is what happens when you respect one another's differences and you celebrate them, not merely tolerate them. And so what I find happening is not so much a melting pot in NYC, but a mosaic. It's a beautiful mosaic. Go in there any day, and you will find it in every conceivable aspect that we talk about diversity. Every aspect. It's there, and it's celebrated daily.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
It's a love everybody always.
Yeah.
From wherever they come from.
Yeah, and that's a culture.
Yes.
And we would hope that culture could be exported to other places. More and more, NYC is seen as a model. Those who come to visit, whether it's Dr. Nirav Shah, who's now with our main CDC director, now has moved to the federal government, or Senator King, or anybody who comes to visit, they leave with the impression that, well, this should be happening everywhere, right?
Yeah. And why isn't it? What Jamie Dorr. Every community needs a Jamie Dorr probably to get this started.
Yeah.
And then
every community, and or at least to be grasped by the vision. And it doesn't have to be necessarily in response to a high rate of suicidality or a term like hopelessness, but it needs to understand that our most fundamental building block of any society are its children. But I don't know why it's so hard for people to recognize that, and then to realize that the marginalized must become our priority for any society to really flourish.
So, I would love to delve into part of what your connection with these young youth is. Involves some wheels, let's say. So talk about
wheels.
Wheels. You're in your 14s, and tell us how you continue that.
Yeah. My bones don't necessarily. So I do pad up. So I'm. I've been a cyclist since I was a kid. I've always had a thing for bicycles. But excuse me. But in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I more recently was, before coming here, I was working with a number of young people who turned me on to something called wheeling. Not that I am personally kind of like a wheelier, because there's skills that I have not yet mastered about that, but I began to run with this crowd of kids who you could look the term up, wheelie in the streets. And I've done it in Bridgeport. I've done it in New York City. I've ridden down the middle of 125th Street in Harlem on a 29-inch bike called an SE bike, called a Fast Ripper, or my D blocks. And it is just the coolest thing. I mean, it is my confession to outside of being arrested in the Bronx a number of years ago on a civil disobedience charge, which I'd love to go into that. It is the most lawless thing I've probably done, is ride in the middle of the street with a pack of teenagers, tearing up the town and blowing through red lights and stuff like that. But man, it is so much better than just shooting people dead. And I'm going to draw that contrast. I was saying, wheels up, guns down. And even the district attorney in Philadelphia has caught a vision to, like, you know what? These kids on bikes doing this stuff, guess what? That's a positive activity, and we should encourage that. And maybe what we need to do is, like, block those intersections when they go through, so they don't have to run the red lights. So sometimes you have to stretch things in order to get some things. But so that was my sort of introduction to the bike life in a big sense. Then coming to Maine, well, we have an indoor skate park. So what do they do in an indoor skate park? Well, they skateboard. That was my son's generation and Jamie's son. But we also do what's thing called BMX biking. They're smaller bikes, and you can do jumps on ramps. And so I do that, and I hurt most of my later day injuries are because of falling off of those bikes. But more lately, I've taken up scootering, which is really popular with the 11, 12, 13-year-olds and older. So that's my new drug of choice is scootering. So
and you ride in the skate park on a scooter, over the ramps, over the jumps.
It's in my. I take it with me everywhere now.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So you're meeting the kids at where they are.
Yeah.
In whatever way you can.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we could do this all day.
We could.
Yeah, but I really appreciate the time.
Oh, it's been awesome.
Just the work that you're doing out there. How, if people wanted to get involved in whatever ways that they might, how would they do that?
Well, they can always drop me an email.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that at dwright, DWRIGHT at straightahead.org.
Great.
Best way to find me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if they wanted to do some more, that would get them to you directly. If they wanted to look up some of these organizations, they would go to...
They would go to straightahead.org to learn about the work we do with justice-involved youth and to look at the community-based work that we do through here in Saginaw County, midcoastyouth.org.
Great. Doran, thanks for all that you do.
Oh,
yeah,
thanks.
You're changing the world.
No, well, I'm being changed. The beautiful thing about this is it's all mutual transformation. Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, good works.
Thank you.